Margaret Sullivan thought she had seen her last sunrise when the fever broke 3 days ago, leaving her weaker than cobwebs in the winter wind. The small farmhouse outside Millfield, Iowa, had become her prison and her sanctuary. 4 walls that held 43 years of memories with her late husband Thomas, and now bore witness to her slow surrender to the consumption that had been eating away at her lungs for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On this particular morning in September 1887, as golden light filtered through dust-laden curtains, Margaret dragged herself to the kitchen window with trembling hands wrapped around her wool shawl. The view hadn't changed. Rolling hills painted in autumn amber, the old oak tree where Thomas had carved their initials, and the winding dirt road that connected their isolated homestead to the distant town. But something was different today. Figures stumbled along that road, moving with the desperate, uneven gait of someone fighting to stay upright. Even from her window, Margaret could see the dark stains on his clothes, the way he clutched his side, how he swayed like wheat in a storm. A wounded man, alone, with no help for miles in any direction. What Margaret couldn't have known as she watched this stranger struggle toward her property was that her simple act of human decency would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only her final days, but the lives of everyone in Millfield County. The man collapsed just 50 yards from Margaret's front gate, his body hitting the dusty ground with a sound that carried across the still morning air. Margaret pressed her face against the cool glass, her breath fogging the window as she watched him try to push himself up, fail and fall back down again. Every rational thought told her to stay inside. She was dying, barely had strength to tend to herself, let alone a stranger who could be dangerous. But 43 years of marriage to Thomas Sullivan had taught her something about the weight of regret, about the kind of choices that follow. You to the grave. Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter and shuffled to the door, each step a negotiation with her failing body. The September air hit her like a gentle slap, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. She could hear the man's labored breathing now, see the way his chest rose and fell in sharp, desperate gasps. "Sir?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, ravaged by months of coughing fits. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Sir, are you hurt?" The man's head turned toward her voice, and Margaret saw a face that couldn't have been more than 25 years old, though pain had aged it beyond its years. Dark hair matted with sweat and dirt, eyes the color of summer storms, and a jaw set with the kind of determination that reminded her of Thomas when he was young. "Ma'am," he managed, the word coming out cracked and dry. "I'm sorry to... I didn't mean to..." Hush now. Margaret found herself moving down the porch steps, though she couldn't remember deciding to do so. "You're bleeding." The dark stains on his shirt weren't mud after all. Fresh blood had soaked through the fabric near his ribs, and older, dried. Blood crusted his sleeve and the side of his face. His left leg was bent at an angle that made Margaret wince. "Got thrown from my horse about 5 miles back," he said, trying to sit up. "Think she spooked a rattler? I'm a scout for the Territorial Survey, ma'am. Name's Daniel Morrison. Daniel Morrison." Margaret filed the name away as she looked at this young man who had literally fallen at her doorstep. There was something about the way he said it with pride despite his current condition that made her think of Thomas and his own quiet dignity. "Well, Daniel Morrison, you're not going anywhere in that condition. Can you make it to the house if I help you?" "Ma'am, I couldn't ask you to..." "You're not asking. I'm telling you." Margaret surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "I may be dying, but I'm not dead yet, and I won't have it said that Margaret Sullivan left a wounded man to bleed out in her front yard." Something shifted in Daniel's storm-gray eyes when she mentioned dying. He studied her face, really looked at her, and she saw the moment he registered the hollowness in her cheeks, the way her clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame, the telltale flush of fever that never quite left her face anymore. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I'd be grateful for your help." Getting Daniel Morrison into the house took nearly 20 minutes and left both of them exhausted. Margaret had to stop 3 times to catch her breath and fight off coughing fits. That left specks of blood on her handkerchief. Daniel did his best to support his own weight, but his injured leg couldn't bear much, and every step sent fresh pain shooting through his ribs. They finally made it to Thomas's old reading chair by the fireplace, where Daniel collapsed with a grunt of relief. Margaret stood swaying for a moment, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision before forcing herself toward the kitchen. "Water, a first," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Then we'll see about those wounds." The well water was cold and clear, drawn up that morning before the heat of the day could warm it. Margaret filled her largest pitcher and grabbed clean rags. From the linen closet, sheets she'd been saving for her own final preparations, though she didn't mention that to Daniel. "Drink slowly," she instructed, holding the cup to his lips. His hands shook too badly to hold it steady, and she found herself supporting the back of his head with her free hand. "Too fast, and you'll just bring it back up." Daniel Morrison drank, like a man who'd been walking through the desert, though he tried to pace himself according to her instructions. Water ran down his chin and onto his shirt, mixing with the dirt and blood there. When he'd finished the first cup, Margaret refilled it immediately. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in his voice that went deeper than gratitude for water. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You still might, if we don't get you cleaned up and those wounds tended." Margaret settled herself, in the chair across from him, fighting another coughing fit. "How long since you've eaten?" "Yesterday morning, I think." "Time gets fuzzy when you're hurt." Margaret nodded. She knew about time getting fuzzy, though in her case it was the fever and weakness that made days blend together like watercolors in rain. "I'll make some broth once we get you patched up. You need something in your stomach." She began cleaning. The wound on his head first, working carefully around the matted hair. The cut wasn't deep, but head wounds always bleed more than they should. Daniel winced but didn't pull away, even when she had to scrub away dried blood and dirt. "You said, you're a territorial scout," Margaret said as she worked, partly to distract him from the pain, and partly because she was curious. "That's dangerous work." "Can be. We map new territories, assess land for potential settlements, survey for the railroad companies sometimes. It's mostly peaceful, but you're out there alone for weeks at a time. Plenty of chances for things to go wrong. Like spooked horses. Like spooked horses." Daniel managed a weak smile. "Though I've got to say, ma'am, that rattler probably saved my life. If my horse hadn't thrown me, I never would have ended up here, and I was already getting pretty delirious from the heat and blood loss." Margaret moved to the cut on his arm, which was deeper and still seeping fresh blood. She pressed a clean rag against it firmly, causing Daniel to suck in a sharp breath. "Sorry," she murmured. "This one needs more pressure." "It's fine. I've had worse." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" "Margaret." "And yes. When you said you were dying, how long do you have?" The question hung in the air between them, neither harsh nor gentle, just honest. Margaret appreciated that. She was tired of people dancing around the subject, tired of false optimism and empty reassurances. "Dr. Patterson says maybe a month. If I'm lucky, could be less." She continued working on his arm as she spoke, her movements steady and practiced. "Consumption. It's been eating away at me for the better part of a year now." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I've had a good life. 43 years married to the finest man God ever put on this earth, a farm that provided for us, friends in town who cared about us. Some people live twice as long and never have half as much." Daniel studied her face as she worked, and Margaret could feel the weight of his attention. There was something in his expression that reminded her of Thomas when he was thinking through a complex problem, a kind of focused intensity that suggested wheels turning beneath the surface. "Do you have a family?" he asked. "Children?" Margaret's hands stilled for a moment on the bandage she was winding around his arm. "No children. Thomas and I, it just never happened for us. We had each other, and that was enough. No one to take care of you now. I can take care of myself well enough, and when I can't—" She shrugged, tying off the bandage with more force than necessary. "Well, that'll be that. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The wound on Daniel's ribs was the worst of the three, a deep gash that had clearly been bleeding on and off for hours. Margaret had to cut away part of his shirt to get to it properly, and even her gentle touch made him go pale around the edges. "This needs stitching," she announced after examining it closely. "I've got a needle and thread, but I won't lie to you. It's going to hurt. Do what you need to do." Margaret retrieved her sewing basket from beside the fireplace, selecting the finest needle she had and the strongest thread. Thomas had taught her to stitch wounds during their early years, when the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away and farm accidents were a regular occurrence. "Bite down on this," she said, offering him a wooden spoon. "And try not to move." Dishes. First stitch made Daniel's entire body go rigid, and Margaret heard the wooden spoon crack between his teeth. But he didn't cry out, didn't pull away. She worked as quickly as she could while still being careful, pulling the edges of the wound, together with small, precise stitches. "There," she said finally, tying off the thread. "That should hold you together." Daniel spat out the remains of the wooden spoon and let his head fall back against the chair. His face was slick with sweat, and his breathing came in shallow pants. But the bleeding had stopped. "Thank you," he said when he could speak again. "I don't know how to repay you for this." "Don't need to repay. Just get better and get on with your life." Margaret cleaned up the bloody rags and returned the sewing basket to its place. When she turned back, she found Daniel watching her with that same intense expression from before. "What?" she asked. "You're not what I expected when I saw this place from the road." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Maybe someone older, more settled. You can't be much past 40. 43 last month. And I am settled. Been in this house for 20 years come Christmas." Daniel shook his head. "That's not what I meant. You move like someone who's still got a fight left in her. Talk like someone with plans." Margaret felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest, though it came out more like a cough. "Plans? Son, my biggest plane is making it through today without collapsing, tomorrow if I'm lucky. But you still made broth for me. Still. Spent 20 minutes helping me into the house when you could barely stand up yourself. That's just being decent." "No," Daniel said quietly. "That's being alive." Margaret stared at him. This young stranger who'd stumbled into her dying days and somehow managed to see something in her that she'd forgotten was there. For months now, she'd been focused entirely on the process of dying, managing pain, conserving strength, preparing for the end. She'd stopped thinking about living. "I should start that broth," she said, turning away from his steady gaze. The kitchen felt different as she moved around it, pulling vegetables from the root cellar and setting water to boil. For the first time in weeks, she was cooking for someone else, planning a meal that wasn't just about getting enough nutrition to survive another day. It was a small thing, but it felt significant in a way she couldn't quite name. Daniel had dozed off in Thomas's chair by the time she returned with 2 bowls of vegetable broth. The lines of pain had eased somewhat from his face, and his breathing was deeper and more regular. Margaret set his bowl on the small table beside the chair and settled into her own seat with her portion. The broth was good, better than anything she'd bothered to make for herself in recent weeks. She found herself actually tasting it, noticing the way the carrots had sweetened it, how the herbs from her garden added depth and warmth. When had she stopped paying attention to simple pleasures like this? Daniel woke when she was halfway through, her bowl blinking in confusion for a moment before his eyes focused on her face. "How long was I out?" "Not long. 20 minutes, maybe." Margaret gestured toward his bowl. "Eat what you can. Your body needs fuel to heal." Daniel managed about half the broth before his eyelids started drooping again. Margaret could see exhaustion pulling at him, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from trauma and blood loss. "You need to sleep properly," she said. "The spare bedroom upstairs has a decent bed, but I don't think you're in any shape to climb stairs. We can make up the couch. I don't want to impose. Daniel Morrison, you listen to me. You're hurt, you're miles from town, and night's coming. You're not going anywhere tonight, and probably not tomorrow either. The couch is comfortable enough. And it's better than sleeping on the ground." Something in her tone must have convinced him not to argue further. Margaret gathered blankets and pillows, moving more slowly than she would have liked, but managing to make up a reasonable bed on the old sofa. "There's a chamber pot behind the screen if you need it during the night," she said, trying not to sound as winded as she felt. "And call out if the pain gets too bad. I've got laudanum if it comes to that." "Margaret?" Daniel's voice stopped her as she headed toward the stairs. "Yes? Why did you help me?" "Really?" Margaret paused with one foot on the bottom step, thinking about his question. The easy answer was that it was the right thing to do, the decent thing. But there was more to it than that, something she was only just beginning to understand herself. "I suppose," she said slowly, "because you gave me something to do besides die." She left him with that thought and climbed the stairs to her own bedroom, though she doubted either of them would sleep much that night. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the first hints of the cold front that would arrive by morning. Winter was coming to Iowa, but for the first time in months, Margaret found herself curious about what tomorrow might bring. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of movement downstairs. For a moment, panic seized her. Had Daniel taken a turn for the worse? She wrapped her nightgown around her thin frame and crept to the top of the stairs, listening intently. The sounds weren't those of a man in distress. Instead, she heard the careful clink of dishes, the soft scrape of a chair being moved, the whisper of fabric against wood. Someone was trying very hard to be quiet. She found Daniel in the kitchen, fully dressed despite the early hour, attempting to wash the dishes from the night before with his good arm. His movements were careful and deliberate, favoring his injured side, but there was a determination in his posture that hadn't been there when he'd collapsed in her yard. "You should be resting," Margaret said from the doorway. Daniel turned, and she was surprised to see that some color had returned to his face. "Morning, Margaret. I wanted to help with something before I left." "Left?" Margaret moved into the kitchen, noting how Daniel had already swept the floor and tidied the surfaces. "You're in no condition to travel." "I feel better. The sleep helped. And my leg's not as bad as I thought. I can make it to town if I take it slow." Margaret studied his face, reading the signs she'd learned to recognize during Thomas's years of farming injuries. Daniel was putting on a brave front, but she could see the tightness around his eyes, the way he kept his weight shifted off his injured leg. "Sit down," she said firmly. "Let me look at those wounds. Margaret, I don't want to be a burden. Daniel Morrison, if you don't sit down right now, I'm going to fetch my husband's shotgun and make you sit down." The threat was absurd. Margaret could barely lift a water pitcher, let alone a shotgun, but something in her tone made Daniel comply. He settled gingerly into the kitchen chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. Margaret examined the bandages she'd applied the night before. The head wound looked clean, already beginning to scab over. His arm was healing well too, though she changed the dressing to be safe. But when she unwrapped his ribs, she frowned at what she found. "You tore 2 of the stitches," she announced, poking gently at the edges of the wound, "and this area here is more swollen than it should be. It's fine. It's infected." Margaret's voice brooked no argument. "See this red streak? That's poison working its way into your system. You try to travel in this condition, and you'll be dead before you reach the county line." Daniel looked down at the wound, and Margaret saw the moment reality hit him. His shoulders sagged slightly, the bravado deflating like a punctured balloon. "How long?" he asked quietly. "With proper care and rest? A week, maybe 10 days if you're lucky." Margaret began cleaning the infected area with carbolic acid, ignoring Daniel's sharp intake of breath. "If you try to leave now, probably 3 days. I can't stay here for a week. You're sick and I'm already taking advantage of your kindness. You're not taking advantage of anything, and I may be dying, but I'm not helpless." Margaret finished cleaning the wound and began applying. Fresh stitches were needed. "Besides, what else am I going to do with my time? Sit around waiting to expire?" Daniel was quiet while she worked, but Margaret could feel him thinking. When she tied off the last stitch, he looked up at her with those storm-grey eyes. "Can I ask you something?" "Seems to be your favorite question." "Yesterday you said you and Thomas never had children. Did you want them?" The question caught Margaret off guard. Most people avoided the subject entirely, treating childlessness like a shameful secret. She paused in wrapping the fresh bandage, considering her answer. "For a while, yes. When we were young, we thought it would happen naturally. When it didn't, we tried different things. Saw doctors, took tonics, prayed harder." She secured the bandage with more care than necessary. "Eventually, we realized we were complete as we were. Not everyone's meant to be parents. Do you regret it now? Not having someone to carry on after you're gone?" Margaret finished with the bandage and sat back, studying this young man who seemed determined to ask the questions everyone else danced around. "I used to think legacy was about blood, about passing down your name and your land to your children, but Thomas taught me differently. He said legacy is about the things you do that outlast you, the kindness you show, the problems you solve, the ways you make the world a little better than you found it." "And what's your legacy going to be?" "I don't know yet. Maybe taking care of a wounded scout when I could have left him to die in my front yard." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a kind of recognition that made Margaret suddenly self-conscious. She busied herself putting away the medical supplies, aware that he was still watching her. "Tell me about Thomas," Daniel said. "What was he like?" Margaret found herself smiling, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "Thomas was steady. That's the word that comes to mind first. Not boring, not predictable, just reliable. When he said he'd do something, it got done. When he made a promise, he kept it." She moved to the stove, stoking the fire back to life. "He was quiet, but not because he didn't have anything to say. He just thought before he spoke, made sure his words mattered. And he was funny in this dry way that could catch you off guard." "How did you meet?" "At a church social in town. I was 18 and I thought I was pretty sophisticated." Margaret chuckled at the memory. "I was holding court with 3 different young men, talking about some book I'd read, probably showing off terribly. Thomas was standing at the edge of the group, just listening." She put coffee on to brew, the familiar routine soothing in its simplicity. After a while, one of the other boys said something that was completely wrong about the book, just factually incorrect. I was about to correct him when Thomas spoke up very quietly and said, "I think Margaret might have a different view on that," and that impressed you. It impressed me that he'd been listening carefully enough to know I disagreed, and that he found a way to let me speak without making the other boy look foolish. It was thoughtful. Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee, noting how the simple act of storytelling had energized her. She'd been carrying these memories alone for so long that sharing them felt like setting down a heavy burden. We started talking. After that, and I realized he'd actually read twice as many books as I had, but he never made me feel ignorant or showed off his knowledge. He asked questions that made me think harder about what I'd read. Sounds like a good man. The best. Margaret settled across from Daniel with her coffee. He proposed 6 months later, right there in my father's parlour. No grand gestures, no fancy speeches. Just looked at me and said, "Margaret, I think we'd make a good life together. What do you think?" And you said yes. I said yes. We were married the following spring, and we had 22 years together before the fever took him. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee thoughtfully. "Do you think he'd approve of you helping me?" "I know he would. Thomas always said that hospitality was one of the highest virtues, that you never knew when you might be entertaining. Angels unaware. I'm no angel, no. But you're someone's son, someone's hope for the future. That's enough." The conversation lulled into comfortable silence as they finished their coffee. Outside, the sun was fully up now, painting the kitchen, in golden light that reminded Margaret of happier mornings. For a moment she could almost imagine Thomas was just out in the barn, that he'd come through the door any minute with news of the livestock and plans for the day. "Margaret?" Daniel's voice brought her back to the present. "Yes?" "I need to send word to my supervisor about what happened. Let him know I'm alive and where I am. Is there someone in town who could take a message?" Margaret nodded. "Old Pete Henderson runs the mail route between here and Cedar Falls. He comes by every Wednesday and Saturday. That's tomorrow, so you could send a letter with him. I'll need to write to my family, too. They'll be worried if they don't hear from me." "Family?" Margaret felt a small stab of curiosity. "Where are they?" "Back in Pennsylvania, my parents and my sister Clara. She's getting married next month, and I promised I'd be there." The mention of a wedding reminded Margaret sharply of all the celebrations she'd never see, all the family milestones that would happen after she was gone. But instead of the usual melancholy that accompanied such thoughts, she found herself interested in Daniel's life. "Tell me about Clara." Daniel's face lit up in a way that transformed his features. "She's 3 years older than me, and she's been bossing me around my whole life, smart as a whip, stubborn as a mule, and she's got the biggest heart of anyone I know. What's her intended to be like?" "James Wheeler. He's a good man, steady, hard-working, treats Clara like she hung the moon. They've been courting for 2 years, and he finally worked up the courage to ask our father for her hand." Margaret found herself smiling at the obvious affection in Daniel's voice. "You're close to your family, very. It's been hard being away so much for work. But the money's good, and I'm saving up to buy some land of my own eventually." "What kind of land?" "Something like this, actually." Daniel gestured toward the window and the view of Margaret's farm. "Good soil, enough space for crops and maybe some livestock. A place where I could settle down, start a family of my own someday." "You'll make a good farmer," Margaret said, and meant it. "You've got the temperament for it." "What makes you say that?" "You're patient, you listen before you speak, and you're not afraid of hard work." Margaret studied his face. "Plus, you appreciate what you have instead of always wanting more." "How can you tell that?" "Because you've been here less than a day. And you've already swept my floors, washed my dishes, and asked me more about my life than most people have in the past 6 months. You see what needs doing and you do it." Daniel looked down at his hands, and Margaret thought she saw a flush of color in his cheeks. "My mother raised me to be useful. She raised you right." They spent the rest of the morning talking about Daniel's work as a scout, about Margaret's years on the farm, about books they'd both read, and places they'd both seen. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in months, and she noticed that Daniel seemed to be relaxing too, the tension leaving his shoulders as the pain medication she'd given him took effect. Around noon, Daniel dozed off again in Thomas's chair, and Margaret took the opportunity to really look at him. In sleep, the lines of pain and exhaustion softened, and she could see the boy he must have been not so long ago. There was something about the shape of his face, the way his hair fell across his forehead, that reminded her of the sons she'd once imagined having. The thought should have made her sad, but instead it filled her with an unexpected warmth. Here was this young man, far from home and family, who'd stumbled into her dying days and somehow made them feel less like an ending and more like something else. Not a beginning, exactly, but a continuation of the story she'd thought was finished. Margaret settled in her own chair with some mending, content to let Daniel sleep and to enjoy the simple pleasure of not being alone. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of Pete Henderson's wagon making its weekly rounds. Tomorrow, Daniel will send his letters. In a week or so, he'd be well enough to travel. But for now, for this moment, Margaret Sullivan had someone to take care of again, and that felt like the most precious gift she could have asked for. She picked up Thomas's old shirt, the one she'd been meaning to mend for months, and began working on the torn sleeve. Her stitches were small and neat, the kind that would hold for years to come, even though she knew she wouldn't be there to see them tested by time. But Daniel would be, and somehow that was enough. The third day brought unexpected visitors to Margaret's door. She was tending her small vegetable garden behind the house when she heard the distinctive creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of horses approaching. Daniel, who had been reading one of Thomas's books on the front porch, called out a warning. "Margaret, someone's coming up the road. 2 riders and a wagon." Margaret straightened slowly, her hands automatically brushing dirt from her apron. Visitors were rare enough under normal circumstances, but with Daniel staying at the house, she wondered what conclusions people might draw. The thought shouldn't have bothered her. She was dying, after all, and past caring about gossip. But old habits of propriety died hard. The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and Margaret recognized the driver immediately. Dr. Ezra Patterson, the physician who had delivered her death sentence 3 months ago. Beside him sat a woman Margaret didn't know, someone younger with kind eyes and practical clothes. The 2 riders following behind were Deputy Sheriff Frank Coleman and his nephew Billy, both of whom tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Patterson called out, climbing down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man approaching 70. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. We heard you might have a guest." Margaret glanced toward the porch, where Daniel had closed his book and was watching the proceedings with alert interest. Word traveled fast in small communities, and she realized Pete Henderson must have mentioned seeing Daniel when he'd collected the mail yesterday. "Dr. Patterson. Always a pleasure." Margaret moved toward the group, noting how the unknown woman was studying her with professional interest. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Well, several things, actually." The doctor gestured toward his companion. "First, I'd like you to meet Miss Catherine Hayes. She's a nurse from Cedar Falls, recently returned from training in Chicago. Catherine, this is Mrs. Margaret Sullivan." Catherine Hayes stepped forward with a warm smile and an outstretched hand. "Mrs. Sullivan, it's an honor to meet you. Dr. Patterson has told me so much about your situation." Margaret shook the offered hand, immediately noting the firm grip and the small calluses that spoke of hands accustomed to work. "Has he now? All bad, I'm sure." "On the contrary, he's mentioned your remarkable strength and independence." Catherine's eyes were sharp, but not unkind as they assessed Margaret's appearance. "Though I can see you've lost more weight since his last visit." "Hard to keep weight on when food tastes like sawdust," Margaret replied dryly. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat. "The other reason for our visit is to check on the young man Pete Henderson mentioned seeing here. A territorial scout," he said. Margaret looked toward the porch, where Daniel was already making his way down the steps despite his injuries. His movements were still careful, but much improved from 3 days ago. "That would be me, sir," Daniel said, extending his hand to the doctor. "Daniel Morrison. I'm afraid I had an accident with my horse, and Mrs. Sullivan was kind enough to take me in." Dr. Patterson shook Daniel's hand while studying his face with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading the signs of injury and illness. "Pete mentioned you looked pretty worse for wear. How are you feeling now?" "Much better, thanks to Mrs. Sullivan's care. She's quite the physician herself." "Is she now?" Dr. Patterson turned to Margaret with raised eyebrows. "Let me have a look at what she's done for you, young man." Margaret found herself standing awkwardly to one side as Dr. Patterson examined Daniel's wounds. She watched Catherine Hayes watching her, and had the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated, in ways she couldn't quite identify. "Excellent work," Dr. Patterson announced after checking the stitches on Daniel's ribs. "Clean, precise, and healing well, despite the early infection. You said Mrs. Sullivan treated you?" "Every bit of it. Cleaned the wounds, stitched what needed stitching, diagnosed the infection before I even realized I had one." Daniel's voice carried genuine admiration. "I'd probably be dead if she hadn't taken me in." Dr. Patterson turned to Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Where did you learn to stitch wounds like that?" "Thomas taught me. We were a long way from town in the early years, and farm accidents don't wait for convenient timing. And the infection diagnosis: red streaking, increased swelling, fever. Didn't take a medical degree to recognize the signs." Catherine Hayes stepped forward. "May I ask what you used to treat it?" "Carbolic acid for cleaning, willow bark tea for the fever, and these." Margaret pulled a small jar from her apron pocket. "Honey and crushed garlic mixed together. My grandmother's remedy." Catherine examined the jar with interest. "Honey for its antimicrobial properties and garlic for the elation. That's actually quite advanced thinking." "It's common sense mixed with desperation," Margaret replied, but she felt a small flush of pride at the approval in Catherine's voice. Deputy Coleman, who had been quietly observing the medical discussion, stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, we'll need to file a report about your accident. Insurance purposes and such. When did it happen, and where exactly?" Daniel provided the details of his fall, describing the location and circumstances with the precision Margaret had come to expect from him. As he spoke, she noticed Catherine Hayes had moved closer to her and was studying her with that sharp, professional gaze. "Mrs. Sullivan," Catherine said quietly, "might I have a word with you privately?" Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness, but nodded. "Of course. Shall we go inside?" They left the men discussing the accident report and made their way into Margaret's kitchen. Catherine accepted the offer of coffee and settled herself at the table with the comfortable ease of someone accustomed to making herself at home in unfamiliar places. "You're wondering why I'm really here," Catherine said without preamble. "The thought occurred to me. Dr. Patterson is concerned about you. He says you've been refusing any kind of help or nursing care." Margaret bristled slightly. "I don't need nursing care. I'm managing fine on my own." "Are you?" Catherine's voice was gentle but direct. "When was the last time you had a full meal? When did you last sleep through the night without coughing? How much weight have you lost in the past month?" "I'm dying, Miss Hayes. These things are to be expected. They don't have to be endured alone." Catherine leaned forward, her expression earnest. "I've seen consumption take people in many different ways. Some die in agony, isolated and afraid. Others live their final months with dignity, surrounded by care and comfort. The difference isn't in the disease, it's in the support they receive." Margaret stared into her coffee cup, seeing her own thin reflection in the dark surface. "I appreciate your concern, but I can't afford nursing care. The farm is mortgaged, and what little money Thomas left is barely enough to keep me fed." "What? If I told you, that wouldn't be a problem. I'd ask what you meant by that." Catherine smiled. "There's a program through the Territory Medical Association. We're training nurses in rural care, and we need practical experience. I would live here, help with your daily needs, learn from your experience treating patients like Mr. Morrison. You'd receive care, and I'd receive training. No money would change hands." Margaret looked up sharply. "You want to use my dying as a learning experience?" "I want to help you die well," Catherine said simply. "And if I can learn something that helps me care for other people in your situation, then your experience serves a greater purpose." The words echoed something Thomas might have said, and Margaret felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. "How long would this arrangement last?" "As long as you need it. As long as you want it. And if I say no, then I thank you for the coffee and wish you well. But I hope you'll consider it. You've obviously got significant medical knowledge and experience. That wisdom shouldn't die with you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering. The idea of having company, of not facing her final weeks entirely alone, was more appealing than she wanted to admit. But there was another consideration. What about Daniel? Mr. Morrison, I mean. He's got several more days of recovery ahead of him. What about him? People talk. A single woman, a young man staying in her house, even a dying woman can have her reputation questioned. Catherine's laugh was warm and genuine. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'll be here as chaperone if that's what concerns you. Though honestly, anyone who would question the motives of a woman caring for an injured stranger probably isn't worth worrying about." Through the window, Margaret could see Daniel talking animatedly with Dr. Patterson and the deputy. His colour was much better, and he was gesturing with both hands as he described something. In just 3 days, he'd gone from a man at death's door to someone obviously on the mend. "You really think you could learn something from me?" Margaret asked. "I know I could. You diagnosed and treated a serious infection using folk remedies that actually work. You've managed your own terminal illness with remarkable grace. And you've provided care and comfort to a stranger when you could barely care for yourself." Catherine paused. "Those are skills that can't be taught in medical school. They have to be learned from experience." Margaret thought about Thomas, about his philosophy of legacy and making the world better. Here was a chance to pass along something useful, to ensure that her knowledge didn't die with her. "When would you start?" "Today, if you're willing. I've brought enough supplies for a week, and Dr. Patterson can arrange for more if needed." Margaret looked around her kitchen, Thomas's kitchen, and tried to imagine sharing it with someone else. It felt like a betrayal and a relief at the same time. "There would be conditions," she said finally. "Name them." "This is still my house, my kitchen, my routine. I won't be treated like an invalid until I actually am one." "Agreed. And I want to continue caring for Mr. Morrison until he's well enough to travel. He's my patient, of course. And no false cheer, no pretending I'm going to recover, no treating me like I'm already gone. I'm dying, not dead." Catherine extended her hand across the table. "You have my word on all of it." Margaret shook the offered hand, sealing an agreement that felt both momentous and inevitable. As they rejoined the men outside, she caught Daniel's eye and saw a flicker of something that might have been relieved across his features. "Gentlemen," Catherine announced, "it appears I'll be staying for a while to assist Mrs. Sullivan with her recovery care." Dr. Patterson nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Margaret, you'll be in good hands." As the doctor and deputy prepared to leave, Daniel approached Margaret with an expression of concern. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Having a stranger move in?" "She's not entirely a stranger anymore. And besides," Margaret glanced toward Catherine, who was efficiently unloading supplies from the wagon, "I have a feeling I'm going to learn as much from her as she does from me." The afternoon was spent in arrangements and adjustments. Catherine proved to be tactfully efficient, taking over the heavier household tasks without making Margaret feel useless. She prepared dinner with skill that suggested extensive experience cooking for invalids, managing to make simple foods taste better than Margaret had managed in months. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, Margaret, Daniel, and Catherine sharing a meal and conversation, Margaret realized something had fundamentally changed in her small world. For months, her house had felt like a place where she was waiting to die. Now, suddenly, it felt like a place where people were living. The realization should have been bittersweet, a reminder of everything she was losing. Instead, it filled her with a quiet satisfaction. She might be dying, but she wasn't done living yet, and she certainly wasn't done being useful. As Catherine cleared the dishes and Daniel settled in for another evening of reading by the fire, Margaret looked around her kitchen and felt for the first time in months that she was exactly where she belonged. The fourth morning brought news that would change everything. Daniel had received a response to his letters through Pete Henderson's mail route, and the expression on his face as he read the correspondence made Margaret's heart sink before he even spoke. "Bad news?" Catherine asked, looking up from where she was organizing medical supplies on the kitchen counter. Daniel folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "My supervisor is sending a replacement scout to finish my survey work. They need me back in Pennsylvania immediately." Immediately? Margaret felt an unexpected pang at the thought of Daniel leaving. "What's the urgency?" "Clara's wedding has been moved up. James received an offer for a position with the Pennsylvania Railroad, but he has to start within the month. They've decided to marry next week, so Clara can travel with him to his new assignment in Pittsburgh." Catherine paused in her work. "That's wonderful news for your sister, but you're still not fully healed. That's a long journey for someone in your condition." "I'll manage. I have to." Daniel's voice carried a determination that reminded Margaret of Thomas when he'd made up his mind about something. "Clara's counting on me to be there. She's the only sister I have." Margaret understood family obligations better than most. If Thomas had been alive and needed her, she would have crawled to him on her hands and knees. But understanding didn't make the prospect of Daniel's departure any easier to accept. "When would you leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if possible. There's a train from Cedar Falls that connects to the Eastern lines. If I catch it, I can be home in time for the ceremony." Catherine wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the table where Daniel sat. "Let me examine those wounds one more time. If you're determined to travel, we need to make sure you're as prepared as possible." As Catherine checked Daniel's injuries, Margaret found herself studying his face, memorizing the details she'd grown accustomed to over the past week. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he was concentrating, the small scar above, his left eyebrow, the particular shade of gray, his eyes turned when he was thinking deeply about something. "The infection is completely gone," Catherine announced, "and the stitches can come out in another day or two. You'll need to be careful not to strain the area, but I think you can manage the journey if you take frequent rests." Daniel nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Thank you, both of you. I don't know how to properly express what your care has meant to me." "You don't need to express anything," Margaret said quietly. "Just get to your sister's wedding and be happy." The rest of the day was spent in preparations for Daniel's departure. Catherine helped him pack his few belongings and prepared a small medical kit for the journey. Margaret found herself at loose ends, unsure how to help and reluctant to admit how much she dreaded his leaving. That evening, as they shared what would be Daniel's last dinner at her table, the conversation was more subdued than usual. Even Catherine, normally full of questions about medical treatments and local remedies, seemed content to let comfortable silences fill the spaces between words. "Margaret," Daniel said, as Catherine cleared the dishes, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped onto the front porch, where the September evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Daniel leaned against the railing, favoring his injured side, and looked out over the darkening landscape. "I want you to know," he began, "that this week has been significant for me, not just because of the medical care, but because of what you've shown me about strength and dignity." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "I haven't shown you anything special. I've just been getting by." "No, it's more than that. You're facing the worst thing that can happen to a person, and you're doing it with grace and kindness and concern for others. That's not getting by. That's heroic." "Daniel, please, let me finish." He turned to face her fully. "I've been thinking about what you said about legacy, about the things we do that outlast us. I want you to know that your kindness to me will outlast you. I'll carry it with me for the rest of my life." Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back firmly. "You would have done the same for me." "Maybe. I hope so. But the point is, you did it when it mattered." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped object. "I have something for you. Daniel, you don't need to. It's not a gift exactly. It's more of a promise." He pressed the package into her hands. "Don't open it until after I'm gone. But when you do, remember that some connections between people don't end just because circumstances change." Margaret held the small package, feeling its weight in her palm. What kind of promise? The kind that means this isn't really goodbye. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, Catherine appeared in the doorway. "I hate to interrupt, but Margaret, you're starting to look tired. You should probably get some rest." Daniel straightened immediately. "Of course, I should let you both get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." Margaret wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't tired, to find some reason to extend this last evening together. But Catherine was right. She could feel exhaustion pulling at her bones, and the conversation with Daniel had stirred emotions she wasn't sure she had the strength to process. "Good night, Daniel," she said quietly. "I hope your journey goes smoothly." "Good night, Margaret. Thank you for everything." Margaret climbed the stairs to her bedroom with Catherine's help, the small package Daniel had given her clutched tightly in her hand. She placed it on her nightstand without opening it, honoring his request, but intensely curious about its contents. "He's a good young man," Catherine observed as she helped Margaret into her nightgown. "Yes, he is. You've grown fond of him." It wasn't really a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "He's easy to be fond of. Reminds me of Thomas when he was young." Catherine settled Margaret into bed and checked her pulse and temperature, a routine they'd established over the past few days. "It's going to be quiet here without him." It was quiet before he came. "I'll adjust." But even as she said it, Margaret knew it wasn't entirely true. The house had felt different with Daniel in it, more alive, more purposeful. His departure would leave a void that went beyond simple companionship. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of Daniel moving around downstairs, gathering his belongings for the journey to Cedar Falls. She listened to his careful footsteps, the soft closing of doors, the whispered conversation with Catherine in the kitchen. Part of her wanted to get up, to see him off properly, to have one last conversation. But a larger part of her recognized that goodbyes were easier when they were brief and final. Drawn-out farewells only made the leaving harder for everyone involved. Instead, she lay in bed and listened as a horse and cart arrived. Old Pete Henderson, she realized, coming to take Daniel to the train station. She heard Daniel's voice thanking Catherine, heard the front door close, heard the cart wheels begin their journey down the dirt road. Only then did Margaret rise and go to her window. In the early morning light, she could see Daniel sitting beside Pete in the cart, his small bag of belongings at his feet. As if he sensed her watching, he turned and looked back toward the house. Even at that distance, she could see him raise his hand in a final wave. Margaret lifted her own hand to the glass, pressing her palm against the cool surface in a gesture of farewell. Then the cart disappeared around the bend in the road, and Daniel Morrison was gone from her life as suddenly as he had entered it. The house felt impossibly empty when Margaret made her way downstairs. Catherine had prepared breakfast, but the kitchen seemed too large with only 2 people in it. The chair where Daniel had sat for the past week looked abandoned, and Margaret found herself avoiding looking at it directly. "He left something for you," Catherine said, placing a folded paper beside Margaret's coffee cup. Margaret unfolded the note, recognizing Daniel's careful handwriting. "Dear Margaret, words feel inadequate. To express my gratitude for everything you've done for me. You saved my life, but more than that, you reminded me what true kindness looks like. I will never forget the lesson you've taught me about facing adversity with grace. Please take care of yourself and let Catherine help you. You deserve comfort and companionship during this difficult time. I hope we will meet again, if not in this world, then in whatever comes after. With deepest respect and affection, Daniel Morrison P.S. Remember what I said about promises." Margaret read the note twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in her apron pocket. The small package from the night before still sat unopened on her nightstand, and she found herself torn between curiosity and the desire to save whatever message it contained for when she most needed comfort. "Are you all right?" Catherine asked. "Gently, I will be." Margaret managed a small smile. "It's just an adjustment, that's all." "It's more than that, and you know it. You cared about him." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. When she spoke again, her words were barely above a whisper. "I forgot what it felt like to have someone to worry about, someone whose future mattered to me. I'd forgotten how that could make a person feel more alive." Catherine reached across the table and covered Margaret's hand with her own. "That's not something to regret. I don't regret it, I miss it already. They spent the day establishing new routines without Daniel's presence. Catherine proved to be excellent company, intelligent, well-read, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that reminded Margaret of Thomas. But the house still felt different, quieter in ways that had nothing to do with actual noise levels. That evening, as Margaret sat in her chair by the fireplace, she finally opened Daniel's package. Inside was a small piece of polished wood, carved into the shape of an acorn. The craftsmanship was simple but skillful, and when Margaret turned it over, she found initials carved into the bottom, DM and MS. Wrapped with the carving was another note. "This is carved from oak wood I found near your property. Thomas carved your initials into that old oak tree by the road, but I thought you might like to have something smaller to keep with you. Oak trees live for hundreds of years and drop acorns that grow into new trees. Even when the original tree dies, life continues in new forms. This is my promise, that your kindness will grow into new kindness, your strength will inspire new strength, and your legacy will continue long after you're gone. And maybe, if I'm very fortunate, I'll have the chance to prove that to you someday." Margaret held the carved acorn in her palm, feeling its smooth weight and warm wood grain. She thought about oak trees and acorns, about legacies and promises, about the strange way a dying woman and a wounded stranger had found connection in the midst of their separate struggles. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter was coming to Iowa. But for the first time since Daniel's departure, Margaret felt something other than emptiness. She felt anticipation, though she couldn't have said exactly what she was anticipating. Catherine looked up from her book. "Good news?" Margaret closed her fingers around the acorn and smiled. "A promise," she said. "And I'm beginning to think Daniel Morrison is the kind of man who keeps his promises." 3 weeks passed after Daniel's departure, and autumn settled over Iowa with the quiet determination of a season that knew its purpose. Margaret's condition had deteriorated noticeably. Catherine documented it with clinical precision while maintaining the gentle care that had become the foundation of their daily routine. The carved oak acorn never left Margaret's side. She carried it in her apron pocket during the day and kept it on her nightstand while she slept, finding comfort in its smooth surface and the promise it represented. But as the days stretched into weeks, with no word from Daniel, Margaret began to wonder if promises made in moments of gratitude were meant to be kept. Catherine proved to be more than just a skilled nurse. She had become a true companion, someone who could discuss literature as easily as medical treatments, who could make Margaret laugh even on her worst days. But more importantly, she had become a careful observer of Margaret's life and wisdom, documenting not just medical symptoms, but the practical knowledge that Margaret had accumulated over her years on the farm. "Tell me about the willow bark preparation." "Again," Catherine said one morning as she helped Margaret into her robe, "the measurements and steeping time." Margaret had grown accustomed to these requests. Catherine filled notebook after notebook with remedies, techniques, and observations that she planned to take back to her medical training program. It gave Margaret satisfaction to know that her knowledge would outlive her, that other patients might benefit from treatments she'd learned through necessity and experience. 2 cups of water, brought to a rolling boil. Strip the inner bark from young willow branches, never the outer bark. It's too bitter and less effective. You want about a handful of the inner bark, chopped fine. Pour the boiling water over it, and let it steep for 20 minutes, no more. Strain it through clean cloth and drink it while it's still warm. Catherine wrote quickly, her pen scratching across the paper. And for what conditions? Pain, fever, inflammation. It won't cure anything serious, but it makes suffering more bearable. Thomas used it for his arthritis in the winter months. The active compound is similar to what they're calling salicin in the medical journals. Your grandmother's knowledge was ahead of its time. Margaret managed a weak smile. Grandmother would have laughed at the idea of her common sense being ahead of anything. She just knew what worked. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching. Margaret's heart gave a small leap. Visitors were still rare, and part of her couldn't help hoping that Daniel might have returned early from Pennsylvania. But when she looked out the window, she saw a familiar buggy carrying Dr. Patterson and another man she didn't recognize. Catherine answered the door, welcoming the visitors with professional courtesy. The stranger turned out to be Dr. William Barnes from the Territorial Medical Association, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an authoritative bearing. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Patterson said after introductions were made, "Dr. Barnes has come specifically to meet with you and Miss Hayes. It seems word of your collaboration has reached some important ears." Dr. Barnes stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've been reviewing Miss Hayes's reports on your case. Your knowledge of practical medicine is quite remarkable for someone without formal training." Margaret felt Catherine stiffen slightly beside her, and she suspected her young friend was sensing the same condescension in Dr. Barnes's tone that she was. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, offering no elaboration. "I'm particularly interested in your diagnostic abilities. Miss Hayes mentioned that you identified an infection in the young scout before he showed obvious symptoms. How did you know?" "Experience. When you've treated enough wounds, you learn to recognize the early signs." Dr. Barnes nodded as if Margaret had confirmed something he already suspected. The Territorial Medical Association is developing new training protocols for rural medicine. We're looking for documented cases of successful folk treatments that could be incorporated into formal medical education. "You want to study me like a specimen," Margaret said bluntly. "I prefer to think of it as preserving valuable knowledge. Miss Hayes has been doing excellent documentation work, but we'd like to expand the scope, bring in other physicians to observe your treatments, document your methods more extensively." Margaret looked at Catherine, who was clearly uncomfortable. with the direction the conversation was taking. What does Catherine think about this? Miss Hayes is here to learn, not to make policy decisions, Dr. Barnes replied, before Catherine could speak. Actually, Catherine said firmly, I think Mrs. Sullivan's comfort and dignity should be the primary consideration. She's not a textbook, case to be studied. She's a person facing a terminal illness who happens to possess valuable knowledge. Dr. Barnes's expression tightened slightly. Miss Hayes, I appreciate your concern for your patient, but this is bigger than individual comfort. The knowledge Mrs. Sullivan possesses could benefit hundreds of future patients. Margaret felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same anger she'd felt when well-meaning neighbors suggested she should fight harder against her illness, as if dying were a personal failing rather than a biological inevitability. Dr. Barnes, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. I'm willing to share what I know with Catherine because I trust her judgment and I believe she'll use the information wisely. But I'm not interested in becoming a curiosity for physicians who see folk medicine as quaint but inferior to their formal training. Mrs. Sullivan, I don't think you understand the importance. I understand perfectly. You want to take the knowledge that women like my grandmother passed down through generations of necessity and repackage it as medical innovation. You want to give yourselves credit for discoveries that weren't discoveries at all, just accumulated wisdom that no one with formal education bothered to pay attention to before. Catherine looked surprised by Margaret's vehemence, but Dr. Patterson was nodding slowly, as if he'd expected this response. Furthermore, Margaret continued, I'm dying. My time and energy are limited, and I choose to spend them with people who see me as a person first and a source of information second. Dr. Barnes's face flushed slightly. I'm offering you a chance to contribute to medical progress. No. You're offering to exploit my knowledge while making me jump through hoops for your convenience. There's a difference. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should discuss this at another time, he suggested. Mrs. Sullivan, you've made your position clear, and Dr. Barnes, you've presented your proposal. Sometimes these things need time to develop. After the two doctors left, Margaret found herself exhausted by the confrontation. Catherine helped her to the sitting room, where she collapsed into Thomas's old chair with relief. I'm proud of you, Catherine said quietly. For what? Alienating a man who could probably help advance your career? For standing up for yourself? For recognizing that your dignity is worth more than their research ambitions? Catherine settled in the chair across from her. And you're wrong about my career. Working with you has already taught me more about real medicine than 6 months in any hospital. Margaret studied Catherine's earnest face and felt a surge of affection for this young woman who had become such an important part of her final weeks. What will you do when I'm gone? Margaret asked. Will you stay in rural medicine? I think so. This experience has shown me that there's real value in bringing formal medical training to remote areas, but only if it's done with respect for the knowledge that already exists there. You could make a real difference. I hope so, and I hope I can carry forward some of what you've taught me, not just the medical knowledge, but the approach, the way you treat illness as part of life rather than an enemy to be defeated at all. Costs. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Pete Henderson, who arrived with a letter that made Margaret's heart race when she saw the return address. From Pennsylvania, Pete announced unnecessarily. That young fellow who was staying with you left word that any mail from his family should be brought directly here. Margaret accepted the letter with trembling hands, noting that it was addressed to her rather than being a general communication. Catherine discreetly busied herself in the kitchen while Margaret opened the envelope with care. Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you as well as can be expected. Clara's wedding was beautiful, and she asked me to convey her thanks for the care you provided that made it possible for me to be there. She's very happy with James, and they've settled nicely into their new life in Pittsburgh. I've been thinking constantly about our conversations and the promise I made before leaving. I know you probably think it was just sentiment spoken in a moment of gratitude, but I want you to know that I meant every word. I'm writing to tell you that I'll be returning to Iowa within the next 2 weeks. My supervisor has approved an extended assignment that will keep me in your area through the winter months. Officially, I'm conducting a detailed survey of potential settlement areas in Millfield County. Unofficially, I want to spend time with someone who showed me what real courage looks like. I hope you'll allow me to visit when I return. I understand if your situation has changed, or if you prefer not to have disruptions, but please know that my admiration and affection for you have only grown stronger during our time apart. Please give my regards to Catherine, whose professional skill and personal kindness were evident even in our brief acquaintance. With deep respect and warm anticipation, Daniel Morrison, P.S. I'm bringing someone I very much want you to meet. Margaret read the letter 3 times before the words were fully registered. Daniel was coming back, not just for a brief visit, but for an extended stay, and he was bringing someone, though the letter didn't specify who. Good news? Catherine asked, returning from the kitchen with a cup of tea. Margaret handed her the letter, watching Catherine's face as she read. When she finished, Catherine looked up with a smile that transformed her usually serious expression. He's coming back, she said, and he's bringing someone. I wonder who. Given the way he talked about his family, probably his sister Clara, maybe she wanted to meet the woman who cared for her brother. Margaret felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety. The idea of meeting Daniel's sister was both appealing and daunting. What would a young bride think of a dying widow who had befriended her brother? Catherine, Margaret said slowly, what if my condition has worsened significantly by the time he returns? What if I'm not presentable? Catherine sat down and took Margaret's hands in hers. Daniel Morrison didn't care about appearances when he collapsed in your yard, and he won't care about them now. Besides, you're not as fragile as you think. You've got more fight left in you than you realize. That evening, as Margaret sat by the fire with the oak acorn in her palm, she found herself making plans for the first time in months. She wanted the house to be welcoming when Daniel returned, wanted to be able to offer proper hospitality to whoever he was bringing. Most importantly, she wanted to be strong enough to enjoy whatever time they might have together. The prospect of Daniel's return had awakened something in Margaret that she'd thought was gone forever, the desire to look forward rather than just backward. For the first time since her diagnosis, she found herself caring about tomorrow, not just as another day to survive, but as another day to live. Outside, the October wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, but inside Margaret's house, the air seemed full of possibility. Daniel Morrison was a man who kept his promises, and whatever he was bringing back with him, Margaret intended to be ready for it. The morning Daniel was expected to return, Margaret woke with a mixture of anticipation and terror that left her hands shaking as she tried to braid her thinning hair. The woman looking back at her from the mirror was a shadow of the person who had first tended Daniel's wounds 5 weeks ago. Her cheekbones were sharp angles beneath pale skin, and her eyes seemed too large for her face. Would he be shocked by how much she'd deteriorated? Catherine found her sitting at the dressing table, staring at her reflection with dismay. Having second thoughts? Catherine asked gently. Looking at what I've become. Margaret touched her face with trembling fingers. When Daniel left, I still looked like a person who was merely ill. Now, I look like someone who's been fighting a brave battle, Catherine finished firmly. Margaret, You're not defined by your physical appearance. Daniel Morrison is intelligent enough to see past surface changes to the person underneath. Easy for you to say. You're young and healthy and beautiful. Catherine knelt beside Margaret's chair, meeting her eyes in the mirror. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a woman who diagnoses infections before trained physicians notice symptoms. I see someone who stands up to medical authorities when they try to exploit her knowledge. I see a person who has spent her final weeks teaching instead of wallowing, caring for others instead of focusing solely on herself. Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I just want to make a good impression on whoever he's bringing. You will, not because of how you look, but because of who you are. They spent the morning preparing the house for visitors. Margaret insisted on baking bread, despite Catherine's protests about her conserving energy. The familiar routine of measuring flour and kneading dough gave her something to focus on besides her nervousness. The kitchen filled with the warm, yeasty smell that had always made the house feel welcoming. Around noon, Margaret heard the sound she'd been anticipating for days, horses approaching on the road. She moved to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw a wagon coming up the drive. Daniel sat beside the driver, looking healthier and more robust than when he'd left. But it was the figure sitting in the back of the wagon that made Margaret's breath catch, a young woman with dark hair and a face that was unmistakably related to Daniel's. She was lovely in the way that spoke of good health and happiness, but there was something more, an alertness in her posture, an intelligence in her expression that reminded Margaret immediately of Daniel himself. "Catherine," Margaret called. "They're here." Catherine joined her at the window, and Margaret heard her sharp intake of breath. "Is that his sister, I think?" Clara. But as the wagon drew closer, Margaret noticed something that made her frown. The young woman wore a simple traveling dress, but there was something about the way she held herself, the careful way Daniel helped her down from the wagon, that suggested she might be more than just a visiting sister. Daniel looked toward the house and saw them in the window. His face broke into the warm smile Margaret remembered, and he raised his hand in greeting. Even from a distance, she could see that he looked genuinely happy to be back. Margaret smoothed her dress one final time and moved toward the door, Catherine close behind her. When she opened it, Daniel was already halfway up the front steps, his companion following more slowly. "Margaret," Daniel said, and the warmth in his voice dispelled most of her anxiety. "You look—" He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "You look like someone I've missed very much." The tactful phrasing acknowledged the changes in her appearance without dwelling on them, and Margaret felt a rush of gratitude for his sensitivity. "Daniel, welcome back." She stepped aside to let them enter. "And you must be Clara. I've heard so much about you." The young woman smiled, but there was something tentative in her expression. "Actually, Mrs. Sullivan, I'm not Clara. My name is Rebecca Hayes, and well, this is somewhat complicated to explain." Margaret looked between Daniel and Rebecca, noting the way Daniel's hand hovered protectively near Rebecca's elbow, the way she looked to him for reassurance. There was an intimacy between them that spoke of more than casual acquaintance. "Rebecca is Catherine's younger sister," Daniel explained, "and she's also—" He paused, looking at Rebecca with an expression that made everything suddenly clear. To Margaret. "She's your bride," Margaret said quietly. Rebecca's face flushed pink. "We were married 3 days ago in Pennsylvania." "I know this must seem sudden and strange, but it's wonderful," Margaret interrupted, surprised by the genuine joy she felt. "Please, come in, both of you. Catherine will be thrilled to see her sister." As if summoned by her name, Catherine appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Rebecca, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Becca, what on earth are you doing here? Surprising my sister, apparently." Rebecca's smile became more natural as she crossed the room to embrace Catherine. "Though I have a feeling you're about to be even more surprised when you hear the rest of the news." The next hour was filled with explanations, exclamations, and the kind of controlled chaos that comes when unexpected family reunions coincide with major life announcements. Margaret found herself swept up in the excitement despite her fatigue, watching as Catherine processed the news that her younger sister had married Daniel Morrison after a whirlwind courtship that had begun the day after Clara's wedding. "You have to understand," Rebecca explained, as they all settled in the sitting room with coffee and Margaret's fresh bread. "Daniel talked about nothing but Mrs. Sullivan and the kindness she'd shown him. He described how you'd cared for him when you were so ill yourself, how you'd taught him about dignity and grace in the face of adversity. He made you sound like the most remarkable woman in the world," Daniel added, looking at Margaret with obvious affection. "I wanted Rebecca to meet you because I thought you'd like each other, and because I hoped you might share some of your wisdom with her." Margaret studied Rebecca's young face, seeing Catherine's intelligence, but with a softer, more romantic temperament. "What kind of wisdom could I possibly offer a new bride? The kind that comes from having a truly happy marriage," Rebecca said simply. "Daniel told me about your relationship with Thomas, how you two built a life together based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. That's what I want with Daniel, but I'm not sure I know how to achieve it." The honesty in Rebecca's voice touched something deep in Margaret's heart. Here was a young woman on the threshold of the kind of life Margaret had been blessed to share with Thomas, asking for guidance from someone who had learned through experience what made love last. "Marriage isn't about grand gestures or constant romance," Margaret said slowly. "It's about choosing to be kind to each other every day, even when you're tired or frustrated or disappointed. It's about building something together that's bigger than either of you could create alone." "But how do you maintain that over years and decades?" Rebecca asked. "How do you keep from taking each other for granted?" Margaret smiled, remembering similar conversations with her own young friends in the early years of her marriage to Thomas. "You remember that love is both a feeling and a choice. The feeling comes and goes, that's natural. But the choice to love, to put your partner's needs alongside your own, to forgive daily small failures and celebrate small victories, that choice is what creates lasting happiness." Daniel had been listening intently, and now he leaned forward. "Margaret, there's something else we need to tell you. The reason I was able to arrange an extended assignment here," Margaret felt a flicker of apprehension. "Yes? The Territorial Medical Association has approved a new rural healthcare initiative. They want to establish a model program that combines formal medical training with traditional folk medicine knowledge. Catherine has been selected to lead the program." Margaret looked at Catherine in surprise. "You didn't mention this." "Because I haven't agreed to it yet," Catherine replied. "The position would be based here, in Millfield County. I'd be working with local practitioners like you to document effective treatments, training other nurses in rural care methods, and establishing a clinic that serves the surrounding area. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity." "It is. But it would also mean staying here permanently, making this area my home. And I wanted to know how you felt about that before I made my decision." Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her, chest that had nothing to do with the fever that often plagued her now. "You're asking my permission to build your career around the knowledge I've shared with you? I'm asking if you'd be comfortable with me staying. The position comes with a house, the old doctor's residence in town, but I'd want to continue visiting you regularly, learning from you as long as—" Catherine's voice trailed off delicately. "As long as I'm alive to teach," Margaret finished. "Catherine, nothing would make me happier than knowing you'll be here to help people long after I'm gone." Rebecca had been following this conversation with obvious interest. "Mrs. Sullivan, there's one more thing. Daniel and I have been talking about our future, about where we want to settle once his current assignment is completed." Margaret looked between the young couple, seeing something hopeful and nervous in both their expressions. "We'd like to buy your farm," Daniel said quietly, "if you'd be willing to sell it to us." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, though not an unpleasant one. She had been dreading the thought of what would happen to the land she and Thomas had worked so hard to build into a productive homestead. The idea of it going to strangers, or worse, being sold to pay debts, had haunted her quieter moments. "You want to live here?" she asked. "We want to build our life here," Rebecca corrected gently. "Daniel has told me so much about this place, about the peace he found here during his recovery, and I can see why. It's beautiful, and it has such a sense of rightness to it." Daniel nodded eagerly. "We could take over the mortgage payments, handle the financial arrangements, however would be most beneficial for you. And of course, you'd continue living here for as long as you want. This would still be your home." Margaret felt tears threatening and didn't try to stop them this time. The idea of the farm continuing as a place where people built lives and dreams together, where the land she and Thomas had loved would nurture a new generation, was more than she had dared to hope for. "There's just one condition," she said, looking at both Daniel and Rebecca seriously. "Anything," Daniel said immediately. "You have to promise me that you'll take care of the oak tree by the road. Thomas carved our initials there when we were first married, and it's important." Rebecca's face softened. "We promise, and maybe someday, if you don't mind, Daniel could carve our initials there too." Margaret nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she found her voice again, it was stronger than it had been in weeks. "I think Thomas would be very happy to know that this place will be home to another love story." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself energized by the presence of these three young people who had, in different ways, become so important to her final chapter. Catherine and Rebecca caught up on family news, Daniel shared stories from his sister's wedding, and plans began to take shape for a future that would outlast Margaret's participation in it. For the first time since her diagnosis, Margaret felt not just acceptance of her approaching death, but genuine excitement about the legacy she would leave behind. The farm would continue to be a home. Catherine would use her knowledge to help others, and Daniel had kept his promise in the most extraordinary way possible, by bringing love back to a place where love had once flourished. That evening, as Rebecca helped Catherine prepare dinner, and Daniel split wood for the fireplace, Margaret sat in Thomas's chair and watched the activity around her with deep contentment. The house was alive again, with purpose and affection, filled with the sounds of people building relationships and making plans. The oak acorn sat warm in her palm, its smooth surface worn from weeks of handling. Tomorrow, she would show Daniel and Rebecca where Thomas had carved their initials in the oak tree. She would tell them about the best places to plant vegetables in the spring, which fields produced the best crops, where the well ran deepest and the winter winds hit hardest. But tonight, she was simply grateful to be surrounded by love. The love she had shared with Thomas, the love growing between Daniel and Rebecca, the love of learning and service that drove Catherine's work. It was enough, Margaret realized, more than enough. It was exactly what she had hoped for without daring to ask. November arrived with an early frost that turned the remaining leaves into a tapestry of gold and crimson, and Margaret found herself existing in a strange state of suspended time. Her body continued its slow surrender to the consumption, but her spirit had found a new equilibrium in the presence of the three young people who had transformed her dying days into something resembling a celebration of life. The legal arrangements for the farm transfer had been completed with surprising efficiency. Daniel's savings from his years as a territorial scout, combined with a modest loan from his father in Pennsylvania, provided enough to assume the mortgage and give Margaret a small nest egg for her remaining expenses. More importantly, the knowledge that the land would remain in caring hands had lifted a weight from her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. Rebecca had thrown herself into learning the rhythms of rural life with an enthusiasm that reminded Margaret of her own young bride days. She peppered Margaret with questions about everything from preserving vegetables to predicting weather patterns, taking careful notes in a leather journal that had become her constant companion. "Tell me about the herb garden," Rebecca said one morning as they sat together on the front porch, watching Daniel repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the recent windstorm. "Which herbs are essential, and when should I plant them?" Margaret pulled her shawl tighter against the chill air and studied the young woman beside her. Rebecca had been married for less than 2 weeks, but already she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. "The most important herbs are the ones that heal," Margaret began. "Willow bark for pain and fever, echinacea for infections, chamomile for stomach troubles and nerves. Plant them in early spring after the last frost but before the soil gets too warm. And cooking herbs? Sage, thyme, rosemary, they'll survive Iowa winters if you mulch them properly. Basil and oregano you'll need to replant each year. The key is to plant them where they'll get morning sun but afternoon shade, especially during the hottest part of summer." Rebecca wrote diligently, her pen scratching across the pages of her journal. Margaret had come to love these morning conversations. The way Rebecca's questions forced her to organize knowledge she'd accumulated through decades of trial and error. "Margaret," Rebecca said, looking up from her writing, "can I ask you something personal? At my age, with my condition, everything is personal. Ask whatever you like. When you and Thomas were first married, were you ever afraid? About whether you'd be good enough at being a wife, at managing a household, at all the responsibilities?" Margaret smiled at the familiar anxiety in Rebecca's voice. "Terrified. The first time I tried to cook dinner for Thomas's parents, I burned. The roast so badly we had to bury it in the garden so the smell wouldn't linger in the house. What did you do? Sent Thomas to town for cheese and bread, and we ate by candlelight and pretended it was romantic instead of desperate." Margaret's eyes grew soft with the memory. "His mother never knew, and Thomas never told her. That's when I realized I'd married the right man, not because he was perfect, but because he was kind." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "Daniel has that same kindness. Yesterday, when I accidentally let the chickens out of their coop, he just helped me round them up without saying a word about my carelessness. The chickens needed exercise anyway," Margaret said diplomatically, though she'd watched the entire incident from her bedroom window with considerable amusement. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine, who had ridden over from town with news and a basket of supplies from the general store. Since accepting the position with the Territorial Medical Association, Catherine had been dividing her time between establishing the new rural health clinic and continuing her informal education with Margaret. "Good morning, you two," Catherine called as she dismounted and tied her horse to the porch rail. "Beautiful day for November. Any word from Dr. Patterson about the clinic?" Margaret asked as Catherine joined them on the porch. "Construction should be finished within the month. We'll have examining rooms, a small surgery for minor procedures, and living quarters for visiting physicians." Catherine's excitement was evident in her voice. "And Dr. Patterson has agreed to let me hire an assistant, someone local who can help with both medical care and community outreach." "Have you found anyone suitable?" Catherine smiled mysteriously. "Actually, I was hoping to discuss that with Rebecca." Rebecca looked up from her journal in surprise. "With me? You've been learning so much about practical medicine from Margaret, and you have a natural aptitude for caring for people. I thought you might be interested in training as a medical assistant." Margaret watched Rebecca's face transform as the implications of Catherine's offer sank in. The young woman had been struggling with the question of how to contribute meaningfully to her new community, how to build a life that was more than just being Daniel's wife. "I don't have any formal training," Rebecca said hesitantly. "Neither did I when I started learning from Margaret," Catherine replied. "Medical training is important, but so is intuition, compassion, and practical knowledge. You could learn both approaches, formal procedures and traditional remedies." "What would Daniel think? Why don't you ask him?" Margaret suggested, nodding toward the fence line where Daniel was walking back toward the house, his repair work completed. Rebecca called out to her husband, explaining Catherine's proposal with growing excitement in her voice. Margaret watched Daniel's face as he listened, seeing the same supportive enthusiasm he'd shown when Rebecca had expressed interest in learning to manage the farm. "It sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Daniel said when Rebecca finished explaining. "You'd be helping people, learning skills that would be useful here on the farm, and working with your sister. I can't think of anything better. You wouldn't mind having a wife who works outside the home?" Daniel looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Rebecca, why would I mind you using your talents to help people? That's one of the things I love most about you, your desire to make a difference." Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest as she watched this exchange, remembering similar conversations with Thomas about her own interests and ambitions. Some men saw their wives as ornaments or servants, others saw them as partners. Daniel Morrison clearly fell into the latter category. "I think you should accept Catherine's offer," Margaret said. "This community needs people who understand both, modern medicine and traditional healing. You could bridge that gap in ways that would benefit everyone." The conversation continued over lunch, with plans taking shape for Rebecca's training and the clinic's opening. Margaret found herself energized by the planning process, offering suggestions about local families who might need medical care and traditional remedies that could complement formal treatments. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret felt the familiar fatigue that had become her constant companion. Catherine noticed immediately and suggested she rest, while the others continued their work around the farm. Margaret made her way to the sitting room and settled into Thomas's chair with a book, but found herself watching through the window instead. Of reading, Daniel was showing Rebecca how to properly store the firewood for winter, while Catherine organized medical supplies she'd brought from town. The three of them worked together with an easy harmony that spoke of genuine affection and shared purpose. A soft knock at the door interrupted her observations. Margaret called for the visitor to enter and was surprised to see Dr. Patterson. Stepping into the room with a solemn expression, "Dr. Patterson, I wasn't expecting you today." "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Margaret. I wanted to speak with you privately about your condition." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. Dr. Patterson's tone suggested news she wasn't prepared to hear. "Please, sit down. Has something changed?" Dr. Patterson settled into the chair across from her, his weathered hands folded carefully in his lap. "I've been reviewing the notes Catherine has been keeping about your symptoms and progression. I'm concerned that the decline is accelerating more rapidly than we initially projected." "How much time do I have?" "It's difficult to say with certainty, but based on current indicators, perhaps 2 weeks, possibly less." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, though part of her had been expecting them. She'd felt the changes in her body over the past few days. The increased difficulty breathing, the persistent pain that even willowbark tea couldn't touch, the way simple activities left her completely exhausted. "Does Catherine know?" I wanted to speak with you first. How you choose to share this information is entirely up to you." Margaret nodded, her mind already working through the implications. 2 weeks wasn't long, but it might be enough time to finish what she'd started, to ensure that Rebecca and Daniel were fully prepared to take over the farm, that Catherine had all the traditional medical knowledge Margaret could share, that The loose ends of her life were properly tied up. Dr. Patterson, I need to ask you for a favor. Anything within my power? I want these last days to be meaningful, not just a countdown to death. Can you help me make sure that happens? Dr. Patterson's expression softened. What did you have in mind? I want to compile everything I know about traditional medicine into a comprehensive guide for Catherine to use in her clinic. I want to teach Rebecca everything she needs to know about managing this farm through the seasons. And I want to spend time with all three of them, creating memories that will last after I'm gone. That's a tall order for 2 weeks. Then we'd better get started. Dr. Patterson agreed to help coordinate Margaret's final projects, providing medical supplies and documentation materials while ensuring she had enough pain management to remain functional without being overly sedated. When he left that evening, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace about the timeline she'd been given. That night, as the household settled into its evening routine, Margaret called the 3 young people together in the sitting room. The fire crackled warmly in the fireplace, and the lamplight cast a golden glow over their faces as they gathered around her chair. I have something I need to tell you all, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to share. Dr. Patterson visited me today with news about my condition. She saw Catherine's face change immediately, professional knowledge allowing her to read between the lines of Margaret's careful phrasing. Daniel and Rebecca looked concerned, but not yet alarmed. The consumption is progressing more rapidly than we anticipated. I have perhaps 2 weeks left. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and shock. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth, and Daniel's face went pale. Catherine simply nodded, though Margaret could see tears gathering in her eyes. I know this is difficult news, Margaret continued, but I don't want these final days to be about mourning. I want them to be about completion, about finishing the work we've started together. What can we do? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Help me create something lasting. Help me ensure that the knowledge and love that have sustained this place continue to flourish after I'm gone. Daniel leaned forward, his expression intense. Tell us how. Margaret smiled, feeling the same sense of purpose that had carried her through the most challenging moments of her life with Thomas. We're going to spend the next 2 weeks building a legacy that will outlast all of us. As she outlined her plans for their remaining time together, Margaret felt not sorrow, but gratitude. She had been given the gift of knowing when her story would end, and more importantly, she'd been given the people who would help her write a conclusion worthy of the life she and Thomas had built together. The oak acorn sat warm in her palm as she spoke, a tangible reminder of Daniel's promise and the new growth that would continue long after the original tree had fallen. The final 2 weeks of Margaret Sullivan's life unfolded with the intensity and purpose of a master craftsman, putting finishing touches on their greatest work. Each day brought new urgency tempered by profound peace, as Margaret orchestrated the completion of legacies that would echo through generations. Catherine arrived each morning with notebooks, ink, and an endless supply of questions designed to extract every fragment of medical wisdom from Margaret's memory. They worked systematically through ailments and treatments, documenting not just remedies, but the subtle art of diagnosis that came from decades of observation. Pneumonia in children, Margaret dictated as Catherine wrote furiously, shows differently than in adults. Watch for the way they hold their shoulders, rigid, like they're afraid to move their chest. The fever comes in waves rather than steady heat, and their appetite disappears completely, not just diminished. What about treatment? Steam tents with pine needles if you can get them, chamomile if you can't. Keep them upright as much as possible. Laying. Flat makes breathing harder. And watch their fingernails. If they start turning blue, you need a real doctor immediately. Rebecca proved an eager student of domestic arts, learning to read weather signs in cloud formations, to judge soil readiness by its smell and texture, to preserve food in ways that would sustain the household through harsh winters. Margaret taught her the farm wife's calendar, when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest the fields. The garden plot behind the house gets morning sun, but afternoon shade, Margaret explained as they walked the property despite the November chill. That's where your delicate herbs go, basil, cilantro, the ones that wilt in too much heat. The south field is for corn and beans, but rotate them with oats every third year to keep the soil healthy. Daniel spent hours learning the mechanical aspects of farm management, which tools needed sharpening when, how to read the signs of illness in livestock, where the property boundaries lay, and what responsibilities came with them. But more than technical knowledge, Margaret shared with him the philosophy that had guided her life with Thomas. "This land doesn't belong to you," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "You belong to it. Your job is to care for it so it can care for the next people who come after you. Everything you do should consider not just this year's crop, but what the soil will be like for your children's children." As the days passed, Margaret felt her physical strength ebbing like a tide flowing out to sea. Simple tasks that had required effort now became impossible, and she found herself spending more time in Thomas's chair, directing activities rather than participating in them. But instead of frustration, she felt a deep satisfaction watching these three young people absorb not just her knowledge, but her values. On the 10th day, Deputy Coleman arrived with a visitor who made Margaret's breath catch. A tall woman in traveling clothes stood beside him, her bearing suggesting both authority and compassion. She had the weathered hands of someone accustomed to hard work and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Sullivan," Deputy Coleman said, removing his hat respectfully. "This is Mrs. Eleanor Whitman from the State Medical Board. She's heard about the work you and Miss Hayes have been doing." Eleanor Whitman stepped forward with a warm smile. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've come to personally thank you for your contribution to medical knowledge in our territory. The documentation you and Miss Hayes have compiled will be distributed to rural clinics throughout Iowa and beyond." Margaret felt a flutter of pride mixed with humility. "I'm just sharing what my grandmother taught me and what I learned from necessity. That knowledge has value precisely because it comes from experience rather than theory. We've tested several of your remedies at the State Medical College. Your willow bark preparation is more effective than many commercial fever reducers, and your honey garlic mixture shows remarkable antimicrobial properties." Catherine appeared from the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw Mrs. Whitman. "Eleanor, I didn't know you were coming." "I wanted to meet the teacher who produced such exceptional documentation. Mrs. Sullivan, the medical community owes you a debt of gratitude." As the women talked, Margaret learned that Eleanor Whitman had spent years advocating for the integration of traditional healing practices with formal medical training. The work Margaret and Catherine had done together would become part of a new curriculum for rural medical practitioners. "Your knowledge won't die with you," Eleanor assured Margaret before she left. "It will live on to help thousands of people. You'll never meet." That evening, Margaret asked Daniel to help her to the oak tree by the road. The November wind was sharp, but she wanted to see Thomas's carved initials one more time, to touch the bark that had witnessed their entire marriage. Daniel supported her carefully as she traced the weathered letters with her fingertip. T.S. plus M.S. 1865 was still clearly visible despite 22 years of growth and weather. "Will you really add your initials here?" Margaret asked. "When Rebecca is ready. She wants to wait until spring, when the tree is putting out new growth." Daniel's voice was gentle. "She says new love should be carved when everything is beginning, not ending." Margaret smiled at Rebecca's romantic sensibilities. She's wise for someone so young. She learned from a good teacher. They stood in comfortable silence, watching. The last light fade behind the western hills. Margaret felt Thomas's presence strongly in this place where they'd shared so many conversations about their dreams and plans. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I need you to promise me something, anything. When my time comes, don't let it be medical and clinical. I want to die here in my home, surrounded by people who care about me. Can you ensure that happens?" "You have my word." The next morning brought Dr. Patterson with sobering news. Margaret's breathing had become increasingly labored during the night, and Catherine's careful observations suggested they had perhaps 3 days remaining. Margaret received this information with calm acceptance. "Then we finish everything today," she announced to the assembled group in her sitting room. "The medical documentation is complete. Rebecca knows everything I can teach her about managing the farm. The only thing left is making sure you all understand what you mean to me." She asked Catherine to bring the box of letters and photographs she kept in her bedroom bureau. Sitting surrounded by the 3 people who had become her chosen family, Margaret shared stories she'd never told anyone. About her and Thomas's early struggles, their private jokes and traditions, the dreams they'd held for their future. "This photograph was taken on our 5th anniversary," she said, holding up a formal portrait of her and Thomas in their best clothes. "We'd just survived our first truly difficult year. Crop failure. Thomas's father died. I lost a pregnancy we hadn't told anyone about. We were broke and heartbroken, but we were still together." Rebecca studied the photograph intently. "You both look so determined." "We were. Determined to build something good, despite everything working against us. That's what marriage is, really. Deciding, over and over again, to choose each other no matter what life throws at you." Margaret gave Rebecca her grandmother's recipe collection, handwritten cards yellowed with age and stained with decades of use. To Catherine, she left her collection of pressed medicinal plants, each one carefully labeled with preparation instructions and usage notes. For Daniel, she had something special. "This was Thomas's surveying compass," she said, placing the brass instrument in his hands. "He used it to map every acre of this property, to plan where each building would go, to establish the field boundaries. I want you to have it because you'll be the one making decisions about this land's future." Daniel accepted the compass with obvious emotion. "I'll take good care of it. I know you will. You'll take good care of everything." As evening approached, Margaret asked to be moved to her bed. The effort of the day's activities had exhausted her remaining reserves, and she could feel her body beginning its final surrender. But her mind remained clear, and her heart was full of peace. Catherine arranged her pillows to help with breathing, while Rebecca brought fresh flowers from the last of the garden chrysanthemums. Daniel built up the fire in the bedroom fireplace, ensuring warmth against the November chill. "I want you all to know," Margaret said, as they gathered around her bed, "that these past weeks have been the most meaningful of my life since Thomas died. You've given me purpose when I thought my usefulness was finished. You've shown me that love doesn't end. It transforms and continues." Catherine took her hand. "You've given us far more than we've given you." "That's not true. You've given me the gift of knowing that everything I valued will continue. Catherine, you'll heal people using knowledge that goes back generations. Rebecca, you'll raise children on land that's been loved and tended. Daniel, you'll build something lasting and good." As the night deepened, Margaret's breathing became more difficult, but she remained alert and present with her chosen family. They shared quiet conversations about small things, the way morning light looked different in each season, the satisfaction of bread rising properly, the sound rain made on the roof. Near midnight, Margaret asked Daniel to open the window despite the cold. "I want to hear the wind in the oak tree one more time," she explained. The night air carried the sound of branches moving in the November wind, a whisper that seemed to connect this moment to all the moments she and Thomas had shared. In this room, Margaret closed her eyes and listened, feeling surrounded by love, both past and present. "Thank you," she whispered, though it wasn't clear whether she was speaking to the three people keeping vigil beside her bed, to Thomas's memory, or to the larger forces that had brought them all together. As dawn approached, Margaret's breathing became increasingly shallow. Catherine checked her pulse regularly, while Rebecca held her hand and Daniel sat quietly in the corner, present but unobtrusive. "Is there anything you need?" Rebecca asked softly. Margaret opened her eyes one last time, looking at each of their faces with perfect clarity. "I need you to be happy," she said. "I need you to love each other well, to take care of this place, to remember that kindness matters more than anything else." The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern horizon when Margaret Sullivan drew her final breath. It came as gently as sleep, with no struggle or distress, simply a quiet letting go that left the room feeling hushed and sacred. Catherine gently closed Margaret's eyes, while Rebecca whispered a prayer. Daniel stood at the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold above the oak tree that had witnessed both the beginning and end of Margaret's love story. 3 days later, the cemetery outside Millfield hosted a funeral that surprised everyone with its size. People came from neighboring counties, farmers Margaret had helped during difficult times, children she'd treated for various ailments, families whose lives had been touched by her quiet generosity over the decades. Dr. Patterson spoke about her medical knowledge and the lives it would continue to save. Eleanor Whitman traveled from the state capital to acknowledge Margaret's contribution to rural health care. But it was Daniel who delivered the words that captured her true legacy. "Margaret Sullivan taught us that kindness is not a small thing," he said, standing beside Thomas's headstone where Margaret would soon rest. "She showed us that the way we treat strangers in their moment of need defines who we are. She proved that a life lived in service to others creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see." As the mourners dispersed, Daniel, Rebecca, and Catherine remained beside the grave. The November wind rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. "Now we live the way she taught us to live," Catherine replied, "with purpose, with kindness, with attention to the legacy we're creating." Daniel nodded, pulling the surveying compass from his pocket and watching its needle find true north. "We keep her promises." 6 months later, the rural health clinic opened with Catherine as its director and Rebecca as her trained assistant. The clinic's waiting room featured a small plaque, "In memory of Margaret Sullivan, whose wisdom guides our healing." Patients received treatment that blended the latest medical advances with time-tested traditional remedies, just as Margaret had envisioned. The farm flourished under Daniel and Rebecca's care. That spring, Daniel carved their initials into the oak tree just as Rebecca had wanted, during the season of new growth and fresh beginnings. The letters DM plus RM 1888 joined Thomas and Margaret's declaration of love, creating a testament to the continuity of hope and commitment. Catherine often visited the farm, and on quiet evenings the three friends would sit on the front porch and talk about Margaret's influence on their lives. They spoke of patients helped by remedies she'd taught them, of crops grown using techniques she'd shared, of the way her example had shaped their approach to marriage, friendship, and service. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, they could hear the oak tree whispering secrets that connected their present to all the love stories that had come before, reminding them that kindness, once given freely, creates a legacy that never truly ends. In death, as in life, Margaret Sullivan had kept her promise to make the world a little better than she found it, one act of simple human decency at a time. The dying widow, who had given water to a wounded scout, had discovered that the greatest gift she could offer wasn't healing for his body, but healing for his heart. And in return, He had brought her the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that love, in all its forms, continues long after the lovers themselves have gone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.